It was my 35th birthday, a crisp October afternoon in Boston that smelled of fallen leaves and cinnamon. I'd been looking forward to this day with a mix of excitement and that quiet dread that comes with getting older. Mom had insisted on hosting at the old family home in Cambridge, a beautiful Victorian that had been in our family for 3 generations. I pulled into the driveway, noticing Dad had finally trimmed the massive oak tree that had threatened to swallow the front porch for years. The house looked welcoming with its warm yellow lights glowing from within, a stark contrast to the gray clouds gathering overhead. I sat in my car for a moment, watching relatives arrive with wrapped packages and covered dishes, wondering if this year would be any different from the last. My younger sister Eliza's BMW was already parked in the prime spot closest to the door. Of course it was. "There's the birthday boy," Mom called out as I entered, pulling me into a hug that smelled of her signature vanilla perfume. Dad clapped me on the shoulder, mumbling something that sounded like "happy birthday" before retreating to his favorite armchair in the corner of the living room. The house was packed with the usual suspects: Aunt Meredith with her too loud laugh, Uncle Peter nursing his bourbon by the fireplace, cousins I only saw at family gatherings like this one. My college roommate Steve was there too, having driven up from New York for the occasion, and a handful of neighbors who'd known me since I was in diapers. Thomas. Eliza emerged from the kitchen, glass of white wine in hand, looking immaculate as always in a navy blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "I was beginning to think you weren't going to show up to your own party." She kissed my cheek, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and a trace of lipstick I'd have to wipe off later. "Traffic on the Pike was brutal," I lied. In truth, I'd spent an extra 20 minutes sitting in a coffee shop, mentally preparing for tonight. The party progressed as these things always did: awkward small talk, reminiscing about embarrassing childhood stories, and the inevitable questions about my perpetually single status. I nursed a beer and smiled at all the right moments, occasionally catching glimpses of Eliza holding court among the relatives, her animated gestures punctuating whatever story she was telling. Then came time for cake and presents. Mom had outdone herself with a 3-tiered chocolate creation that seemed excessive for the 20 or so people present. I blew out the candles to a chorus of off-key singing, making a wish out of habit rather than hope. As people began cutting into the cake, Eliza clinked her fork against her wine glass, drawing everyone's attention. "I'd like to make a toast to my big brother," she announced, her voice carrying that theatrical quality she'd perfected during her brief stint in community theater years ago. "Thomas, who always does everything by the book and never takes risks." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the room. Steve shot me a concerned glance from across the table. "But today isn't just special because it's Tommy's birthday," Eliza continued, using the childhood nickname she knew I hated. "It's special because I have an announcement of my own to make." Mom beamed, probably expecting news of an engagement or pregnancy. Dad actually looked up from his plate, momentarily interested. "Mom and Dad have decided that I'm going to inherit the family home," she declared, raising her glass higher. They finally recognized which of their children would appreciate it more. The room went silent. I felt heat rising to my face as all eyes darted between Eliza and me. "Isn't that right?" Eliza looked pointedly at our parents, who seemed frozen in confusion. "Eliza, that's not," Mom started, but my sister cut her off with a laugh. "Oh, don't be so modest. We've discussed this for months." She turned back to the crowd. "Meanwhile, poor Thomas here will probably get Dad's collection of moth-eaten sweaters and maybe a pair of socks." Her laughter rang hollow in the suddenly tense room. I couldn't breathe. The wall seemed to close in as I tried to process what was happening. Was this some kind of cruel joke? A power play? Or had my parents actually made this decision without telling me? "That's not what we discussed at all," Dad finally spoke up, his voice gruff with irritation. "We said we hadn't decided anything yet." "But we all know where this is heading," Eliza insisted, though her confident smile had begun to falter at the edges. "The house needs someone who will preserve its history, not someone who's barely here." I set down my fork carefully, the cake turning to ash in my mouth. "Well, "This is certainly an interesting birthday surprise," I managed to say, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the earthquake happening inside me. Steve quickly stood and changed the subject, suggesting it was time for presents. The guests latched onto this lifeline, eager to escape the awkwardness. I went through the motions of opening gifts, a watch from my parents, books, clothes, gift cards, all while feeling strangely detached from my body. Later, as guests began to depart, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Mom, who was wrapping leftover cake in aluminum foil with shaking hands. "Thomas, about what Eliza said," she began, not meeting my eyes. "It's fine," I interrupted, though it was anything but. "It's your house. You can do whatever you want with it." "But we haven't decided anything." She looked distressed now. "Your father and I mentioned we were thinking about the future, that's all." Eliza just took it and ran with it. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Through the kitchen window, I could see Eliza in the backyard, smoking a cigarette she didn't think our parents knew about, looking smugly satisfied with herself. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already taken steps of my own. Steps that would make tonight's little performance a footnote in a much longer story. As I drove home through the darkening streets of Boston, the rain finally beginning to fall, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. My sister thought she had won something that was already beyond her reach. And soon enough, she would learn just how wrong she was. I stepped into my apartment in Somerville, tossing my keys into the ceramic bowl on the entryway table. The remnants of my birthday celebration, a half-deflated balloon and a happy birthday banner hanging crookedly across my living room, seemed to mock me after the evening's events. Rain tapped against the windows as I moved to my home office, kneeling before the small safe I kept hidden behind a stack of law textbooks. I spun the dial, hearing the familiar clicks until the door swung open. Inside, nestled among insurance papers and my passport, sat a manila envelope. I pulled it out and spread its contents across my desk. 6 months ago, when Dad had his second heart attack, I began to worry. Not just about his health, but about what would happen afterward. He and Mom weren't getting any younger, and they'd never been particularly organized with their affairs. The family home, that beautiful, aging Victorian in Cambridge, had been the backdrop to our entire lives, but its future remained uncertain. One afternoon, while helping Dad sort through his medication, I'd casually brought up estate planning. To my surprise, he confessed they hadn't updated their will since Eliza and I were children. That night, I couldn't sleep, imagining my sister sweeping in and somehow convincing our parents to give her everything. Eliza had always been the favorite, more outgoing, more ambitious, and infinitely better at manipulating our parents than I ever was. So I made a decision. I still wasn't sure if it was the right one, but it was done now. I stared at the deed to my parents' home, officially transferred into my name 3 months ago. Next to it lay the power of attorney documents they'd signed, giving me control over their financial decisions, just in case something happens as I'd framed it. Mom and Dad had been so relieved to have someone handling the paperwork that they barely read what they were signing. Was it underhanded? Maybe. Legal? Absolutely. I'd made sure of that. As a paralegal at Harrington and Walsh, I had access to resources most people didn't. Jim Walsh himself had reviewed the documents as a favor, never questioning why I wanted everything transferred so discreetly. I took a sip of the whiskey I'd poured myself and leaned back in my chair. The irony of tonight wasn't lost on me. Eliza's boast about inheriting the house had struck a nerve precisely because she had no idea the matter was already settled. The house was mine, at least on paper. My phone buzzed with a text from Steve. "You okay?" "That was rough. Call me tomorrow." I didn't respond. How could I explain that while Eliza's announcement had humiliated me in front of everyone, I'd already outmaneuvered her in ways she couldn't imagine? The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of my third-floor apartment. I gathered the documents and returned them to the safe, feeling the weight of my secret pressing down on me. This wasn't how I'd wanted things to play out. When I'd initiated the transfer, I'd told myself it was merely a precaution, a way to ensure that Mom and Dad's home wouldn't be lost to taxes or creditors if something happened to them. But part of me knew there was more to it. Eliza and I had been in silent competition our whole lives. She was the golden child, head cheerleader, student body president, and now a successful marketing executive whose face appeared regularly in Boston Business Monthly. I was the reliable one, quiet, studious, always there to pick up the pieces, but never in the spotlight. The house represented more than just real estate. It was validation, recognition, proof that I mattered just as much as my sister. I poured another drink and wandered to the window, watching the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement below. I wondered what Mom and Dad were discussing now in the aftermath of Eliza's announcement. Were they confused about her certainty? Worried about my feelings? Or perhaps planning to actually give her the house, unaware that they no longer legally could? My laptop chimed with an email notification. It was from Eliza. "Tommy, sorry if I ruffled your feathers tonight. You know how I get with a few glasses of wine in me. But seriously, we should talk about the house situation. I have big plans, and I think Mom and Dad are on board. Let's grab coffee this week?" Hugs and kisses. I closed the laptop without responding. The audacity was so typically Eliza. Even in her half-apology, she was still pushing forward with her claim. My phone rang, Mom's name appearing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses or, worse, confirmation that they had indeed been discussing giving the house to Eliza. The documents in my safe provided a certain comfort, a shield against the familiar pain of being second best. I made my way to bed, but sleep eluded me. Images of the house filled my mind, the creaky third stair that we'd all learned to skip over, the window seat in the living room where I'd spent countless hours reading, the kitchen table where we'd had Sunday dinners even after Eliza and I had moved out. The house held our history in its walls, and now its future rested in my hands. As rain continued to fall outside, I grappled with conflicting emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing I'd protected my interests, but also shame at the secrecy of my actions. I'd always prided myself on being the honest one, the ethical one, yet here I was, harboring a secret that could tear my family apart. Morning came with weak sunlight filtering through my blinds. I had barely slept. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Mom, 2 from Dad, and another text from Eliza, this one less conciliatory. "Seriously, why are you ignoring everyone? Don't be such a baby about this." I got ready for work mechanically, the routine providing some comfort amid the emotional chaos. As I knotted my tie, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, older somehow, the weight of my secret evident in the shadows under my eyes. At the office, I buried myself in work, drafting contracts and filing motions with an intensity that kept my colleagues at a distance. Jim stopped by my cubicle around noon. "Everything okay, Thomas? You seem off today." I forced a smile. "Just tired." Birthday celebrations went a bit late. He nodded, not entirely convinced. "Well, those property transfers you had me look over, all filed properly. The recorder's office confirmed everything's in order." My stomach tightened. "Thanks, Jim. I appreciate your help with that." "No problem. Family homes are important to protect." He paused. "Your parents must be relieved to have someone so responsible looking out for them." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me. I mumbled something affirmative and turned back to my computer, shame burning in my chest. That evening, I finally listened to Mom's voicemails. Her voice was anxious, apologetic. "Thomas, please call us. What Eliza said wasn't true. We need to talk about this as a family." I sat on my couch, phone in hand, contemplating my next move. The deed was secure in my safe. The legal matters were settled. But the emotional fallout was just beginning. And I knew that sooner or later, I would have to face my family and the consequences of my actions. The weeks following my birthday unfolded in a strange, tense rhythm. I'd finally called Mom back after 3 days of silence, keeping the conversation brief and deliberately avoiding any mention of the house. She seemed eager to smooth things over, her voice carrying that familiar anxious tone she used whenever there was conflict between Eliza and me. "Your sister gets carried away sometimes," she'd said, as if that explained everything. "You know how she is." I did know. I'd known my entire life. November arrived with its characteristic New England chill, the trees along my street now bare, their skeletal branches scraping against my bedroom window at night. I threw myself into work, volunteering for extra cases and staying late at the office. Jim had noticed, commenting that while he appreciated my dedication, I looked like hell. I'd brushed off his concern with a vague excuse about insomnia. The truth was more complicated. Every night, I'd lie awake, replaying my sister's announcement at the party, imagining different ways I could have responded. Sometimes, in these late-night scenarios, I stood up dramatically and revealed my trump card, the deed safely locked away in my apartment. Other times, I simply walked out, leaving Eliza to her delusions. But in reality, I'd done nothing, and that passivity haunted me. Sunday dinners at my parents' house became exercises in avoidance. I'd show up exactly on time, help with the dishes afterward, and leave as soon as was politely possible. Eliza, for her part, had apparently decided to pretend nothing had happened. She chatted about her latest promotion, her new condo renovation, and her weekend trips to New York, all while shooting me occasional glances to see if I was paying attention. I was, but not in the way she wanted. I noticed how she lingered in rooms after dinner, running her fingers along the crown molding or commenting on how she'd update the space when the time comes. I saw her measuring the dining room with her eyes, probably mentally replacing our mother's antique furniture with whatever sleek, modern pieces were currently in fashion. The Jackson brothers next door are selling their place, she mentioned one Sunday, her fork poised midair. Went for $1.2 million. Can you believe it? Dad grumbled something about the neighborhood changing too fast. Mom looked nervous. This house would probably fetch even more, Eliza continued. Corner lot, original details, that gorgeous bay window in the front. Though it would need some serious updating first. It's not for sale, I said quietly, my first direct challenge to her assumptions. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Of course not, Tommy. I'm just saying, for future reference, this place is a gold mine. The implication was clear. In Eliza's mind, the house wasn't just a family home, it was an investment, an asset to be maximized, perhaps even flipped. That night, driving back to Somerville, I took a detour and parked across from the house, watching the soft glow of the lamps inside. I thought about my childhood bedroom on the second floor, the treehouse Dad had built in the backyard, the kitchen table where I'd done my homework while Mom prepared dinner. This wasn't just real estate. This was our history. At work the next day, I found myself pulling up property values in Cambridge, calculating what the house might be worth on the open market. The number made me wince. With those funds, Mom and Dad could easily finance their retirement, maybe buy a smaller place somewhere warmer. From a purely financial perspective, Eliza's implicit plan to eventually sell made sense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that once sold, something irreplaceable would be lost. Not just the physical structure, but the repository of memories it contained. On a cold Wednesday morning, I bumped into Eliza at Thinking Cup, the coffee shop halfway between my office and her agency. She waved me over to her table, seemingly delighted by the coincidence, though I suspected she'd planned it. She'd always been strategic that way. Just the person I wanted to see, she said, sliding a folder across the table. I've been doing some research. Inside were printouts of luxury retirement communities in Florida and Arizona. Glossy photos showed smiling seniors playing golf and lounging by pools. Highlighted in yellow were the price points, all comfortably affordable with the proceeds from a house sale in Cambridge. Mom and Dad would love these places, she said, stirring her latte. They deserve to enjoy their golden years, don't you think? I closed the folder. Have they expressed interest in moving to a retirement community? She waved a hand dismissively. They don't know what they want. Dad's too stubborn to admit he can't handle the maintenance anymore, and Mom just goes along with whatever he says. It's up to us to help them plan. By us, you mean you, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Her smile tightened. I mean both of us, Tommy. We're in this together, right? For Mom and Dad's sake? The manipulative undertone was so familiar it almost made me laugh. This was classic Eliza, framing her desires as selfless concern for others. "I need to get to work," I said, standing. "Thanks for the coffee." "Wait," she called as I turned to leave. "Thanksgiving's coming up." I thought maybe we could talk to them together then. Present a united front. I paused, considering my options. Playing along might give me insight into her plans. Refusing would only make her suspicious. "We'll see," I replied, noncommittal. That evening, I pulled out the deed again, reading through the legal language I'd memorized months ago. The document was clear. The property at 47 Garden Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, now belonged to Thomas James Wheeler. Not Eliza Wheeler Mitchell. Not our parents. Me. I'd acted out of fear and a desire for security, but now I wondered if I'd overreached. What right did I have to make this decision unilaterally? Was I any better than Eliza, planning the future of our family home without proper discussion? Sleep eluded me again that night. Rain pelted against my windows as I tossed and turned, my mind racing with possible scenarios. If I revealed what I'd done, the fallout would be catastrophic. Mom would be heartbroken, Dad furious. Eliza would never speak to me again, which, honestly, sometimes seemed like a blessing rather than a curse. If I said nothing, I'd be complicit in Eliza's schemes until the moment of truth arrived, when our parents decided to sell, or when they passed away and the will was read, only to discover the house was already long gone from their possession. Either way, a storm was brewing. I could feel it coming, just as surely as I could hear the thunder rolling across the Boston sky. The next morning, my phone rang just as I was leaving for work. It was Steve. "Hey man, you've been ghosting me since your birthday. Everything okay?" I hesitated, the weight of my secret pressing down on me. Steve had been my friend since freshman year at Boston College. If anyone would understand, it might be him. "Not really," I admitted. "It's complicated." I figured. "That thing with your sister was brutal." He paused. "Want to grab a beer after work? Talk it out." "Yeah," I said, surprising myself with the relief I felt. "Actually, that would be great. Maybe talking to someone outside the family would help me gain perspective. Or maybe I just needed to unburden myself before the inevitable confrontation that loomed on the horizon." As I walked to work through the damp streets, leaves plastered to the sidewalk like wet confetti, I felt a strange sense of calm descend. The worst was yet to come, but at least the waiting game would eventually end. One way or another, the truth would emerge. The house, my house, would be at the center of a family reckoning that had been brewing for decades. And when the storm finally broke, I would have to decide whether to stand my ground or surrender what I'd so carefully secured. 3 months passed. Winter descended on Boston with a vengeance, burying the city under record snowfall. I spent Christmas with my parents, but begged off New Year's, claiming a stomach bug. The truth was I couldn't bear another evening of Eliza's thinly veiled comments about the house renovations she was already planning when the time comes. February arrived with bitter winds and gray skies. I'd settled into a holding pattern, going through the motions at work while the weight of my secret grew heavier by the day. Steve had become my confidant after that night at the Beacon Hill pub when, 3 beers in, I'd finally told him everything. "Holy shit, Tom," he'd whispered, eyes wide. "That's either the smartest or the dumbest thing you've ever done." I still wasn't sure which it was. On a particularly brutal Tuesday morning, with the temperature hovering around 10 degrees, I was buried in paperwork at my desk when my cell phone lit up. Eliza's name flashed on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. Our interactions lately had been strained at best, but something made me answer. "Hello?" For a moment, all I heard was ragged breathing. "Eliza? You there?" "Tommy." Her voice was barely recognizable, choked and raw. "I need your help." I sat up straighter, instantly alert. In 35 years, I'd never heard my sister sound like this. "What's wrong? Are Mom and Dad okay?" "They're fine." A muffled sob came through the line. "It's me. I've messed up. Really badly." I glanced at my office door, then lowered my voice. "What happened?" "Not over the phone." She sniffled. "Can you meet me?" "Please, Tommy." I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. My instinct was to refuse, to protect myself from whatever drama she was embroiled in now. But the desperation in her voice was impossible to ignore. Where are you? Home. Not our parents' house, but her luxury condo in Back Bay. Please hurry. I told Jim I had a family emergency and headed out into the bitter cold. The drive across town took longer than usual, the streets narrowed by towering snowbanks. I found parking 3 blocks from Eliza's building and trudged through the slush, my mind racing with possibilities. Had she gotten fired? Was she in legal trouble? Relationship problems with that investment banker she'd been seeing? The doorman recognized me and waved me in without calling up. When I reached her door, I knocked softly. No answer. I tried again, harder. The door opened to reveal a woman I barely recognized. Eliza's perfectly highlighted hair hung in limp strands around her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, mascara smudged beneath them. She wore sweatpants. I'd never seen my sister in sweatpants, and a Harvard hoodie that I was pretty sure belonged to her ex-boyfriend. Jesus, Eliza. What happened? She stepped back to let me in, then collapsed onto her white leather couch. Her usually immaculate apartment was in disarray, empty wine glasses on the coffee table, papers scattered across the floor, a blanket bunched up in the corner. It's all gone, she whispered, staring at the wall. Everything. I shrugged off my coat and sat beside her. What's gone? Talk to me. She finally met my eyes, and what I saw there was sheer panic. The money. My money. The condo. The car. All of it. I shook my head, not comprehending. What are you talking about? Slowly, haltingly, the story emerged. Eliza had invested heavily with a man named Marcus Daniels, someone she'd met through work who had promised extraordinary returns through a revolutionary investment strategy. She'd started small, but as the initial returns came in 20–30%, she'd gone all in. She'd emptied her savings, taken out a second mortgage on her condo, even sold stocks our grandparents had left her. How much? I asked, feeling sick. Almost everything. She covered her face with her hands. Over 800,000. I whistled low. And this Marcus gone. Her voice was flat now, drained of emotion. The SEC is investigating. It was a Ponzi scheme, Tommy. Classic fucking Ponzi scheme, and I fell for it. A harsh laugh escaped her. The brilliant marketing executive who prides herself on seeing through people's bullshit got completely taken. I tried to process this. My sister, confident, successful Eliza, had been thoroughly conned. Part of me, a small, mean part one wasn't proud of, felt a flicker of satisfaction. After years of her condescension, her certainty that she knew better than everyone else, she'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. But that feeling was quickly drowned by concern. What happens now? She stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked Commonwealth Avenue. The bank is foreclosing on the condo. I'm 3 months behind on payments. My credit is destroyed. She turned back to me, her expression bleak. I'm going to lose everything, Tommy. Have you told Mom and Dad? She shook her head vehemently. I can't. Dad's heart couldn't take it, and Mom would just worry herself sick. A fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. They've always been so proud of me. How can I tell them their daughter is a complete failure? I moved to stand beside her, awkwardly patting her shoulder. Physical affection had never been our strong suit. You're not a failure. You made a mistake. An $800,000 mistake. She wiped at her face with her sleeve. The irony is, I was doing it for them, too. I thought if I could double or triple my money, I could buy out your half of the house when the time came, renovate it properly, maybe even help them retire early. My stomach twisted. There was the confirmation she'd been planning to sell the family home all along. And yet, hearing her broken voice, seeing her genuine distress, I couldn't muster the anger I'd been cultivating for months. What do you need from me? I asked finally. She turned to me, her expression shifting from despair to something else, hope, mingled with shame. I need a place to stay. Just until I figure things out. I can sleep on your couch. I won't be any trouble. I blinked in surprise. You want to stay with me? In my tiny Somerville apartment? She nodded, looking miserable. The bank gave me 30 days to vacate. I've got nowhere else to go, Tommy. My friends. She trailed off. Let's just say they're not exactly the type to offer shelter in a crisis. I thought about my one-bedroom apartment with its second-hand furniture and creaky floors, a far cry from her luxury condo. There was barely room for me, let alone another person. And living with Eliza? We'd drive each other insane within days. Yet I couldn't turn her away. Despite everything, she was my sister. Okay, I said finally. But it's temporary. And we'll need some ground rules. Relief flooded her face. Thank you. God, Tommy, thank you. As I helped her pack a few essentials, watching as she tearfully sorted through designer clothes she'd soon have to sell, I realized we were entering uncharted territory. My sister, who had always seemed invincible, was broken. And I, who had secretly schemed against her, was now her rescuer. What neither of us knew then was that this unexpected reversal of fortune was about to bring our long-simmering conflict to a head. The deed in my safe, my insurance against a future where Eliza took everything, was about to become the catalyst for a confrontation decades in the making. That night, as Eliza slept fitfully on my couch, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone. I'd pulled up our parents' number half a dozen times, but couldn't bring myself to call. This wasn't just Eliza's secret now, it was mine too. We were bound together by crisis, these fragile threads of mutual dependence weaving us into a strange new relationship neither of us had ever imagined. 2 weeks into our unexpected cohabitation, the cracks began to show. My apartment, barely adequate for one person, felt suffocatingly small with Eliza's presence. Her designer luggage cluttered my living room, her expensive skincare products crowded my bathroom counter, and her habit of taking hour-long showers depleted the hot water tank daily. More grating than the physical inconvenience was her attitude. Despite her financial ruin, she still managed to critique everything from my coffee maker. You know these pods are terrible for the environment, right? To my work wardrobe, that tie with those shoes? Really, Tommy? I'd come home from a particularly grueling day at the office to find her on my laptop, surrounded by empty takeout containers. Don't you ever cook? She asked without looking up. I'm dying for a home-cooked meal. I bit back a retort about who was paying for the takeout. Instead, I dropped my briefcase and peered at the screen. What are you working on? She minimized the window quickly, but not before I caught a glimpse of a real estate website. Just browsing. A familiar tension knotted in my stomach. Properties in Cambridge? Her shoulders stiffened. Just looking at options. For Mom and Dad. Right. The word came out harsher than I intended. We ate dinner in strained silence, Thai food from the place around the corner that Eliza deemed acceptable, before she retreated to the couch with her phone. I cleaned up, my movements becoming increasingly agitated as I wrestled with my growing resentment. Here she was, broke and living on my charity, still plotting to claim the house she believed would someday be hers. The deed in my safe seemed to pulse like a living thing, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode our fragile truce. Every day that passed without confronting the truth felt like another lie. I made a decision. Grabbing 2 beers from the fridge, I walked to the living room and held one out to her. We need to talk. She looked up warily, taking the beer. About? The house. I sat in the armchair across from her. Our parents' house. Eliza sighed, pushing her hair back. Do we have to do this now? I've got enough on my plate. That's exactly why we need to talk. You're making plans based on assumptions that aren't true. Her eyes narrowed. What does that mean? I took a long swig of beer, gathering my courage. The house. It's not going to be yours. We don't know that, she countered. Mom and Dad haven't decided anything yet. Yes, they have. My heart was pounding now. Or rather, the decision's been made for them. Confusion clouded her face. What are you talking about? I set my beer down and leaned forward. The house isn't theirs to give anymore, Eliza. It's mine. Legally. I have the deed. For a moment, she just stared at me, processing. Then she laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. That's not possible. I transferred the property into my name 6 months ago. Used power of attorney documents they signed. The laughter died on her lips. You're joking. I'm not. That's fraud. Her voice had gone cold. No, it's not. Everything was done legally. They signed the papers. Did they know what they were signing? She was on her feet now, her face flushed with anger. I hesitated. They knew they were putting me in charge of their affairs. But did they know you were taking their house? She was nearly shouting now. I couldn't meet her eyes. Not in so many words, no. Jesus Christ, Tommy. She paced the small room, her movements jerky with rage. I knew you were pathetic, but I didn't think you were capable of stealing from our parents. I didn't steal anything. I stood too, my own anger rising. I protected what was rightfully mine from you. Rightfully yours? She spun to face me. Based on what? Your superior moral character? Her laugh was ugly now. You manipulated our elderly parents into signing over their biggest asset without their knowledge. Tell me how that makes you the good guy. The truth of her words hit me like a physical blow. I sank back into my chair. I was afraid, I admitted quietly. Afraid you'd convince them to give everything to you, like you always do. So your solution was to cheat? Tears were streaming down her face now. God, this is rich. You've spent our entire lives judging me, poor, wounded Tommy, always in his sister's shadow, never getting the recognition he deserves. Meanwhile, you're just as capable of deception as I am. Maybe more so. I stared at the floor, shame burning through me. When I'd executed my plan months ago, it had felt justified, a necessary precaution against Eliza's machinations. Now, sitting across from my broken sister in my shabby apartment, I couldn't remember why I'd been so certain I was in the right. You're living on my couch, I said weakly. And you're living in a lie. She grabbed her coat. I need some air. The door slammed behind her, the sound reverberating through the quiet apartment. I sat motionless, replaying the confrontation in my mind. I'd expected to feel vindicated when I finally told her the truth. Instead, I felt hollow. Hours passed. I tried calling her cell, but it went straight to voicemail. As midnight approached, worry began to override my anger. It was bitterly cold outside, and Eliza didn't know Somerville well. Just as I was about to go looking for her, I heard a key in the lock. She entered quietly, her face tear-stained but composed. Without a word, she hung up her coat and sat across from me, hands clasped tightly in her lap. I've been thinking, she said, her voice raw from crying. About what you did. About what I've done. I waited, sensing she needed to speak without interruption. You were right to be afraid, she continued. I was planning to talk Mom and Dad into giving me the house. I thought I deserved it more than you. A humorless smile twisted her lips. Even now, broke and disgraced, part of me still thinks that. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. You've always been the successful one. You could afford your own place. Why did you need our parents' house too? She looked away. It wasn't about need. It was about. She struggled for the words. Confirmation, I guess. That I was their favorite. The simplicity of her admission stunned me. All these years, I'd assumed Eliza knew she was the golden child, that her position was secure. It had never occurred to me that she might be as insecure as I was, seeking validation in different ways. We're really messed up, aren't we? I said finally. A small laugh escaped her. Looks that way. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of decades of competition and misunderstanding filling the space between us. What are you going to do about the house? She asked eventually. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I don't know. I can't just give it back without admitting what I did. And I can't expect to still have a claim on it after losing everything on a stupid investment. She looked at me directly. But our parents deserve to know the truth. Both truths. She was right. The web of deception we'd both woven was untenable. We'll tell them together, I suggested. Everything. Your financial situation. My legal maneuvers. Let them decide what happens next. She nodded slowly. It's going to break their hearts. Probably, I agreed. But we can't keep living like this. In that moment, a fragile understanding formed between us. We were both deeply flawed, capable of selfishness and manipulation. But we were also the only two people in the world who could truly understand each other's motivations, the unique pressures and expectations that had shaped us. I never intended to kick them out, I said softly. I just wanted to make sure you couldn't sell the place from under them. And I wasn't going to sell it immediately, she admitted. I thought, maybe if I fixed it up, made it really special, they'd see that I was the one who cared more. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. We'd both convinced ourselves we were acting in our parents' best interests, when really, we'd been serving our own needs for validation and security. We should do it soon, Eliza said, standing. This weekend. Before I lose my nerve. I nodded, relieved and terrified in equal measure. Sunday dinner? Sunday dinner, she confirmed. But Tommy. She paused at the threshold of the living room. Whatever happens, I'm grateful you took me in. Not many brothers would have. As she disappeared into the bathroom, I sat alone with the weight of her words. Not many brothers would have. But not many brothers would have secretly taken their parents' house, either. The contradictions of our relationship, the simultaneous love and resentment, trust and suspicion, seemed impossible to reconcile. Yet somehow, in the midst of crisis, we'd found a moment of genuine connection. Whether it would survive the coming confrontation remained to be seen. Sunday arrived with a clarity that seemed almost cruel after weeks of Boston's typical February gloom. Sunlight glinted off the snow piled high along the streets as Eliza and I drove to Cambridge in silence. She'd spent the morning methodically applying makeup as if preparing armor for battle. I'd changed my shirt 3 times, settling on a blue button-down my mother had given me last Christmas. You remember what we agreed? I asked as we turned onto Garden Street. Eliza nodded, her profile tense. Everything on the table. No holding back. No trying to make ourselves look better. We'd rehearsed our confessions over Saturday morning coffee, each of us providing brutal feedback when the other veered towards self-justification. It had been strangely cathartic, this mutual accountability. For perhaps the first time in our adult lives, we weren't competing, we were collaborating in our own undoing. Mom answered the door with her usual enthusiasm, pulling each of us into a hug before we'd even crossed the threshold. The house smelled of roasting chicken and rosemary, the familiar scent triggering a wave of nostalgia that made my chest ache. You're early. Dad's just watching the game, and dinner won't be ready for another hour. She studied our faces, her smile faltering. Is everything all right? We need to talk to you and Dad, Eliza said, her voice steadier than I'd expected. Both of you. Concern clouded Mom's features. Of course, dear. Let me get your father. We settled in the living room where countless family discussions, celebrations, and arguments had unfolded over the years. Dad emerged from his den reluctantly, grumbling about missing a crucial play. He stopped short when he saw our expressions. What's happened? He asked, immediately alert. Are you sick? His eyes darted between us. No, Dad. We're fine. Physically, anyway, I said. But we need to tell you something. Both of us. Mom sat beside him on the sofa, instinctively reaching for his hand. You're scaring me. What is it? Eliza and I exchanged a glance, our carefully planned opening statements evaporating in the face of our parents' concern. In the end, we both spoke at once. I lost all my money in a scam. I transferred the house into my name. The room fell silent. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Dad's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and the beginnings of anger. One at a time, he said, his voice dangerously calm. Eliza, what do you mean you lost your money? So we took turns, laying bare our respective downfalls. Eliza spoke first, detailing the investment scheme, her growing financial troubles, and finally, her homelessness. She didn't try to minimize her foolishness or shift blame. When she finished, she was crying quietly, but there was a dignity in her confession that I couldn't help but admire. Then it was my turn. I explained how I'd manipulated them into signing the power of attorney documents, my fear that Eliza would somehow claim everything, and my secret transfer of the deed. I produced the paperwork from my jacket pocket, setting it on the coffee table between us like an exhibit of evidence. Throughout my confession, Dad's face grew increasingly red. Mom simply looked bewildered, as if she couldn't quite grasp what I was telling her. When I finally finished, the silence was deafening. "Let me get this straight," Dad said eventually, his voice shaking with suppressed fury. "My daughter has bankrupted herself because she trusted a con artist, and my son has effectively stolen our house because he didn't trust his own family." Put that way, it sounded even worse than I'd imagined. "Yes," Eliza and I said simultaneously. Dad stood abruptly, pacing the room. "Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable." He whirled to face us. "What were you thinking?" "Either of you." "I wasn't," Eliza admitted. "I was greedy and careless. And I was paranoid and selfish," I added. Mom picked up the deed, studying it as if she could make sense of the legal jargon. "Thomas, how could you do this without telling us? We trusted you." The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than Dad's anger. "I'm sorry," I said, the words wholly inadequate. "I'll transfer it back immediately." "And what about you?" Dad turned to Eliza. "Where were you planning to live if Tom hadn't taken you in?" She shook her head. "I don't know. I thought maybe here." "Here?" Mom looked genuinely confused. "But you've always said this house was too old-fashioned, too much maintenance." "I know. But it's home." Eliza's voice broke on the word. "And I had nowhere else to go." Dad sank back onto the sofa, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. "All this time, you two have been fighting over who gets the house when we're gone. Did either of you ever consider what we want?" The question hung in the air, a rebuke neither of us had anticipated. In all our scheming and counter-scheming, we'd never seriously considered our parents' wishes for their own home. "What do you want?" I asked finally. Mom and Dad exchanged a look, one of those silent communications that come from decades of marriage. "We've been talking about downsizing for years," Mom said quietly. "This house is too big for just the two of us now. The stairs are getting harder for your father's knees, and the heating bills are outrageous. We were planning to sell it this spring," Dad added. "Use the money to buy a small condo near the water and set the rest aside for you two to inherit eventually." Eliza and I stared at them, then at each other. All our plotting, and they'd been planning to sell all along. "Why didn't you tell us?" Eliza asked. "We were waiting for the right time," Mom said. "And honestly, we were nervous about your reactions. You both have such strong feelings about this place." The absurdity of the situation suddenly struck me, and I let out a laugh that verged on hysterical. "So neither of us was getting the house anyway? Not unless one of you had a few million sitting around to buy it at market value," Dad said drily. Eliza joined in my laughter, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God. We're idiots." "That's one word for it," Dad muttered, but I could see the anger beginning to ebb from his features. Mom moved to sit between us on the love seat, taking each of our hands in hers. "What matters now is where we go from here. Thomas, you'll transfer the house back to us." I nodded vigorously. "First thing tomorrow." "And Eliza, you're staying with your brother?" "For now," she said, glancing at me. "If he'll still have me after all this." "The couch is yours for as long as you need it," I confirmed. Mom squeezed our hands. "Then we'll get through this. As a family." Dad joined us, perching on the coffee table. "But no more secrets. No more plotting behind each other's backs. Do you understand?" We nodded like chastened children. "Good." He clapped his hands decisively. "Now, dinner's almost ready, and I'm starving. We can figure out the details later." Just like that, we were dismissed, our crimes acknowledged but not dwelled upon, our punishment a shared meal rather than banishment. It was so typically our parents that I felt a fresh wave of shame for having doubted their fairness and love. As we moved to the dining room, Eliza pulled me aside. "I still can't believe you transferred the house to yourself," she whispered, a hint of reluctant admiration in her voice. "I still can't believe you lost $800,000 to a guy named Marcus," I countered. She punched my arm lightly. "Touché." Dinner was subdued, but not uncomfortable. We talked about neutral topics, a new restaurant downtown, Dad's bowling league, the neighbor's yappy dog. The undercurrent of our confessions remained, but it didn't dominate the meal. When we left, Mom hugged us both fiercely, whispering, "I love you," in our ears like a blessing and a reminder. The drive back to Somerville was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. As I parked outside my apartment building, Eliza broke the silence. "What do you think happens now?" I considered the question. "They sell the house. We start over. I prove I'm trustworthy again. You build back your finances. Simple as that, huh?" She smiled sadly. "Not simple, but possible." We sat in the car a moment longer, watching our breath fog the windows. The weight I'd been carrying for months had lifted, replaced by a different kind of burden, the work of redemption and rebuilding. "You know what's weird?" Eliza said suddenly. "I feel almost relieved. Like I'm not pretending anymore." I knew exactly what she meant. The exhaustion of deception, the constant vigilance required to maintain our facades, it had drained us both in ways we'd only now begun to understand. "Me too," I admitted. "Though I'm not looking forward to explaining to Jim why I need to untransfer a house." She laughed, a genuine sound free of the sharp edges it usually carried. "And I've got to learn how to live on a paralegal's couch instead of in a luxury condo. It'll build character." "I've got plenty of that already, thanks." We made our way upstairs, the familiar creak of my apartment door now a sound of homecoming for us both. The space that had felt suffocatingly small weeks ago now seemed like a sanctuary, a place where we could be our flawed, human selves without pretense. Later that night, as Eliza slept on the couch and I lay awake in my bedroom, I thought about the house in Cambridge. I'd spent so long fixating on it as a symbol of worth and belonging that I'd almost destroyed the very connections it was meant to represent. The irony wasn't lost on me. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom, "Proud of you both for telling the truth today." It took courage. I stared at the message, warmth spreading through my chest. The path forward wouldn't be easy. There would be awkward conversations, legal complications, financial struggles. Eliza and I would undoubtedly fall back into old patterns at times, retreating to the comfortable roles we'd inhabited for decades. But something fundamental had shifted. The secrets that had divided us, both from each other and from ourselves, had been dragged into the light. And in that exposure, painful as it was, lay the possibility of something new, a relationship built on honesty rather than competition, understanding rather than assumption. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning.